You are conscious right now. Not in a vague, abstract way, but in the most immediate sense possible. You are aware. There is something it feels like to be you in this moment. Thoughts are appearing. Sensations are present. There is an inner perspective that cannot be mistaken for anything else. And yet, despite everything modern science has learned about the brain, we still do not know where that experience comes from. This is not a fringe opinion. It is not a philosophical trick. It is not a gap waiting for a small technical fix. It is one of the deepest unsolved problems in science. For decades, we have been told a simple story. Consciousness is produced by the brain. Neurons fire, information is processed, and somehow subjective experience emerges. Awareness, emotion, identity, and the feeling of being a self are all said to arise from electrochemical activity inside the skull. The story sounds reasonable, it sounds scientific, and it sounds settled, but it is not. The more closely scientists study consciousness, the more uncomfortable the explanation becomes.
Are you
Not
seeing a
because the
spike in the
brain
gamma
is
waves here?
mysterious
Yes,
in a vague
adjusting
way,
the parameters
but because
now.
even
The
complete
subject is
knowledge of
stable.
brain activity seems insufficient to explain experience itself.
What is
We can
causing
measure
that spike
neurons
in the delta
firing.
waves?
We can map brain regions.
We are increasing the
We can
stimulus
predict
now.
behavior. But none of that explains why there is something it feels like to exist at all. Why does activity in matter give rise to experience? Not behavior, not intelligence, not problem solving. Experience. The redness of red, the pain of pain, the feeling of being here rather than nowhere. This question refuses to go away. And the more neuroscience advances, the sharper it becomes. This is where the problem begins. Because if consciousness were simply a product of the brain, then understanding the brain in enough detail should explain consciousness completely. There should be a clear path from physical processes to subjective experience. But there isn't. There is no equation that turns neural activity into awareness. There is no measurement that captures what an experience feels like. There is no theory that explains why a system should be conscious rather than unconscious. And this has led some of the most serious scientists alive to a disturbing possibility. What if the brain is not the source of consciousness? What if it is something else entirely? This idea sounds radical at first, even dangerous. It seems to threaten everything we think we know about science and the mind. But it did not emerge from mysticism or wishful thinking. It emerged from failure, from decades of rigorous attempts to reduce consciousness to physical processes, attempts that explained many things, but never the thing that mattered most. The assumption that the brain produces consciousness is rarely questioned, not because it has been proven, but because it feels unavoidable. The brain is clearly involved. Damage the brain, and consciousness changes. Alter brain chemistry, and experience shifts. Correlation is undeniable. But correlation is not explanation. A radio depends on its circuitry to function. Damage the radio, and the music distorts or disappears. But the radio does not create the broadcast. It receives it. This analogy is not an answer. It is not even a claim. It is a question. And questions like this make many scientists uncomfortable because they force us to confront something we are not used to admitting. We may not know what consciousness is. Not in the deep sense. Not in the explanatory sense. We know how it behaves. We know how it correlates. We know how it breaks. But we do not know why it exists at all. This is not a minor gap. If consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical processes, then something fundamental about reality is missing from our models. Either our understanding of matter is incomplete, or our understanding of consciousness is. Possibly both. This is why consciousness is not just another scientific problem. It is a fault line. It cuts through neuroscience, physics, philosophy, artificial intelligence, and our understanding of what it means to be a self. If consciousness is produced by the brain, then it should be fully reducible to physical interactions. In principle, a complete description of matter should leave nothing unexplained. But if consciousness is not produced by the brain, then the implications are profound. It would mean that experience is not an accidental byproduct of matter. It would mean that awareness is not something that appears only after enough complexity is reached. It would mean that the universe may contain something more fundamental than particles and forces. This does not mean we should accept such ideas. It means we cannot ignore them, because the alternative is pretending that a problem is solved when it is not. For many years, consciousness was treated as something science would eventually explain away. A temporary mystery that would vanish once we understood the brain well enough. That confidence has faded. Today, even researchers who reject non-material explanations openly admit that consciousness remains unexplained. Some go further, suggesting that our current scientific framework may be incapable of explaining it at all. This is not defeatism. It is realism. Science has encountered this situation before. When classical physics failed to explain atomic behavior, the solution was not better measurements. It was a new framework. When gravity failed to fit into Newtonian mechanics, the solution was not refinement, but relativity. Consciousness may represent a similar moment. Not a small gap. A structural one. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if consciousness is not something that emerges from matter, but something that matter interacts with? What if the brain is not a generator, but a filter or an interface or a constraint? These ideas are controversial. They are not consensus. They are not proven. But they exist for a reason. Because the standard explanation does not explain. And ignoring that fact does not make it go away. This is where this exploration begins. Not with answers, but with honesty. We will not assume that consciousness is produced by the brain simply because it feels intuitive. We will not dismiss alternative ideas simply because they sound strange. We will follow the evidence. We will follow the failures. We will follow the questions science cannot yet answer. And we will do so carefully. No spirituality. No mysticism. No claims beyond what can be justified. Only a willingness to confront the possibility that one of our deepest assumptions about reality may be wrong. If consciousness is real, and it undeniably is, then understanding what it is matters. Because how we answer this question changes everything. What the mind is, what reality is, and what it means to be you. For most of modern history, the question of consciousness was not considered a scientific problem. It was treated as something obvious. Something given. Something that simply came along with being human. People experienced thoughts, emotions, and awareness, and that was enough. There was no urgent need to explain it, because there was no framework capable of doing so. That changed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when science began to succeed spectacularly at explaining things that once seemed mysterious. Heat turned out to be molecular motion. Life turned out to be chemistry. The motion of planets turned out to be geometry. And the mind began to look like the next mystery waiting to be reduced. As neuroscience developed, a powerful assumption quietly took hold. The brain, like every other organ, must be doing a job. And that job, it was assumed, was producing the mind. The idea was never announced as a hypothesis. It was absorbed as common sense. After all, when the brain is damaged, consciousness changes. When the brain is altered chemically, experience shifts. When brain activity stops, consciousness appears to disappear. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. The brain causes consciousness. This assumption became so deeply embedded that it stopped being recognized as an assumption at all. It became the starting point for nearly all research into the mind. But there is a difference between a starting point and a proven conclusion. What neuroscience has demonstrated with extraordinary precision is correlation. Certain brain states reliably correspond to certain experiences. Specific neural patterns align with perception, memory, emotion, and decision-making. This is real progress. It is not in question. The mistake happens when correlation quietly turns into explanation. When we say that brain activity causes consciousness, we often mean something much weaker, that brain activity accompanies consciousness. That changes in the brain go hand in hand with changes in experience. But accompaniment is not the same thing as origin. This distinction is rarely emphasized, because in most areas of science, correlation eventually leads to explanation. When we observe consistent patterns, we usually discover an underlying mechanism that accounts for them. With consciousness, that step never arrived. Despite decades of increasingly detailed brain maps, faster imaging, and deeper computational models, the central question remains untouched. Why should any of this activity feel like anything at all? Neurons transmit electrical signals. Chemicals cross synapses. Networks integrate information. All of this can be described objectively, from the outside, in physical terms. None of it explains subjectivity. You can describe a brain in exhaustive detail. You can list every neuron, every connection, every firing pattern. And still, nothing in that description tells you why there is an inner point of view. Why there is something it is like to be that system. This is not a philosophical word game. It is a structural problem. Imagine discovering a complete physical description of a system and still being unable to explain its most obvious feature. Not because the description is incomplete, but because the feature does not appear anywhere in it. That is the situation with consciousness. And yet, the assumption persists. The brain must be the source because what else could it be? This line of reasoning is powerful, but circular. It assumes what it claims to explain. We observe that consciousness depends on the brain. We conclude that the brain produces consciousness. And then we treat that conclusion as established fact. But dependence does not imply production. A television depends on electricity. Cut the power, and the image disappears. That does not mean the television produces the broadcast. It means it requires certain conditions to function. This analogy does not prove anything about consciousness. It simply illustrates a logical gap that is often overlooked. The real question is not whether the brain is involved. It clearly is. The question is whether involvement is the same as generation. For most of neuroscience, this distinction has not mattered. Research can proceed without addressing it. You can study perception, memory, and behavior while leaving the deeper question unanswered. But as research has advanced, the gap has become harder to ignore. The more precisely scientists identify neural correlates of consciousness, the clearer it becomes that correlation alone does not close the explanatory loop. Knowing which brain regions light up during an experience does not explain why that experience exists. It explains when it occurs, not why it occurs. This has led to a quiet shift in tone among researchers who work closest to the problem. Where earlier generations spoke with confidence about consciousness being explained by brain processes, many contemporary scientists speak more cautiously. They acknowledge that something essential is missing. Not data, not detail, but principle. There is no agreed-upon mechanism that explains how physical processes give rise to experience. No widely accepted theory that bridges the gap between objective description and subjective reality. This is not because scientists have failed to try. It is because the assumption that the brain produces consciousness may be doing more harm than good. By treating consciousness as an output of neural computation, research risks explaining everything around the phenomenon while never touching the phenomenon itself. And yet, abandoning this assumption feels dangerous. If the brain is not the source, then what is? That question has kept many researchers within the safety of the prevailing view, even as its limitations become obvious. But science does not advance by protecting assumptions. It advances by identifying where they fail. And the assumption that the brain produces consciousness has never been tested in the way we test other foundational claims. It has been inferred, repeated, normalized, not proven. This does not mean the assumption is false. It means it is unexamined. And unexamined assumptions are often the ones that hold progress back the longest. Part 1 is about recognizing this assumption for what it is. Not rejecting it, but suspending it long enough to ask a more honest question. What do we actually know? We know that consciousness is real. We know that it correlates with brain activity. We know that altering the brain alters experience. What we do not know is why experience exists at all, or why physical processes should give rise to it. Until that question is answered, the claim that the brain is the source of consciousness remains incomplete. And incomplete explanations, no matter how familiar, deserve scrutiny. One reason the assumption that the brain produces consciousness feels so secure is that we can influence experience by manipulating the brain. This fact is undeniable. A small dose of anesthesia can erase awareness entirely. A chemical imbalance can produce intense anxiety or euphoria. A stroke can remove language, memory, or recognition of self. Electrical stimulation of specific brain regions can trigger sensations, emotions, even fragments of memory. From the outside, this looks like control. And control feels like causation. If changing the brain reliably changes experience, then it seems obvious that the brain must be generating that experience. This intuition is powerful, and it explains why alternative ideas are often dismissed before they are even examined. But here again, intuition runs ahead of logic. Control does not automatically imply creation. A dimmer switch controls the brightness of a room. It does not create light. A lens controls the focus of an image. It does not generate the scene. A keyboard controls symbols on a screen. It does not create the meaning behind them. In complex systems, control and production are often confused because they are tightly linked. The brain may be necessary for consciousness to appear in the form we experience. That does not mean it is sufficient to explain consciousness itself. This distinction becomes clearer when we look at how neuroscience actually studies the mind. Most experiments focus on identifying neural correlates of consciousness. These are patterns of brain activity that reliably accompany specific experiences. When a subject reports seeing a face, certain regions activate. When they feel pain, other regions become active. When they fall asleep or lose awareness, global patterns change. These findings are real and valuable. They tell us where and when consciousness appears in the brain. But notice what they do not tell us. They do not tell us why those patterns are conscious rather than unconscious. They do not tell us why activity in one system feels like something, while activity in another does not. They do not tell us why there is an inner perspective at all. Neuroscience excels at third-person description. Consciousness is a first-person phenomenon. This mismatch is not accidental. It is structural. All physical measurements are made from the outside. They describe systems objectively, in terms of observable properties. Consciousness, by contrast, is only accessible from the inside. It is defined by experience itself. No matter how detailed our measurements become, they remain descriptions of structure and behavior, not experience. This creates a unique explanatory gap. In most sciences, once you explain structure and behavior, the phenomenon is explained. Heat is molecular motion. Life is biochemical processes. Sound is pressure waves. But consciousness is not behavior. It is not structure. It is not function. It is experience. And experience does not appear anywhere in the physical description. This is why some philosophers and scientists argue that explaining consciousness is not like explaining other phenomena. It is not just a harder problem. It may be a different kind of problem entirely. One response to this difficulty is to redefine consciousness so that it fits the tools we already have. To equate consciousness with information processing, attention, or reportability. But redefining the problem does not solve it. Information processing can occur without experience. Machines process information all the time. Attention can be modeled computationally. Reports can be generated automatically. None of these things require consciousness. The danger here is subtle. By focusing on what consciousness does, we risk losing sight of what consciousness is. The brain clearly enables complex behavior. It integrates sensory input, predicts outcomes, and guides action. These functions can be studied objectively and modeled mathematically. But experience itself does not behave. It does not compute. It does not output actions. It simply exists. And this is where the explanatory framework begins to strain. If consciousness were just another function of the brain, then in principle we should be able to explain it in the same way we explain memory or vision. But decades of research have not produced anything close to such an explanation. Instead, we have accumulated an ever-growing list of correlations. The brain region associated with pain is active when pain is felt. The visual cortex is active when images are perceived. The default mode network is active during self-referential thought. All true. But none of these observations explain why pain hurts, why images appear, or why there is a sense of self at all. At some point, explanation stops and description repeats itself. This is not a failure of neuroscience. It is a sign that neuroscience may be operating with an incomplete conceptual toolkit. When scientists say that consciousness arises from neural activity, they often mean that consciousness appears when neural activity reaches a certain level of complexity or integration. But arises is doing a lot of work here. It is a placeholder, not an explanation. Saying that consciousness emerges from complexity does not tell us why complexity should produce experience. It simply restates the mystery in different words. Emergence explains patterns. It does not explain presence. This is why some researchers argue that consciousness is being treated as a side effect, rather than as a fundamental feature that needs its own explanation. If consciousness were truly nothing more than a byproduct of brain activity, then its existence would be optional. There would be no reason for the universe to contain experience at all. And yet, here it is. Not as an occasional anomaly, but as the defining feature of our existence. Every observation, every theory, every measurement occurs within consciousness. It is the medium through which all science is done. This makes consciousness unique among scientific problems. It cannot be placed entirely outside the observer because it is what makes observation possible in the first place. Ignoring this fact does not make it disappear. It simply pushes it out of sight. The assumption that the brain produces consciousness allows science to move forward without confronting this deeper issue. It provides a working model that is good enough for many purposes. But good enough is not the same as complete. As long as consciousness is treated as something that will eventually be explained away, the core question remains untouched. Why does a physical system have an inner life? This question is not answered by pointing to neurons, circuits, or algorithms. It is not answered by demonstrating control or correlation. It requires a different kind of explanation. And this is where the discomfort begins. Because if the brain does not fully explain consciousness, then something else must be involved. And whatever that something is, it does not fit neatly into our current picture of the world. That does not mean the picture is wrong. It means it is unfinished. Part 1 is not about replacing neuroscience. It is about recognizing its limits. About seeing where explanation quietly turns into assumption. Only then can we ask the next question honestly. At this point, it becomes important to understand exactly where the explanation fails. Not emotionally, not philosophically, but structurally. Most scientific explanations work by reducing complex phenomena to simpler components. Once those components and their interactions are understood, the phenomenon is considered explained. This method has been extraordinarily successful. Life was once thought to require a special vital force. Today, it is understood as chemistry organized in specific ways. Heat was once treated as a substance. It turned out to be molecular motion. Lightning was once divine. It became electricity. Each time, something mysterious was shown to be nothing more than matter behaving according to physical laws. It is tempting to assume consciousness will follow the same pattern. But consciousness resists reduction in a way these other phenomena did not. When you explain heat as molecular motion, nothing essential is left out. The feeling of warmth corresponds directly to measurable physical activity. There is no remainder. With consciousness, there is always a remainder. You can explain every behavioral and functional aspect of a mental state without explaining the experience itself. You can describe how pain causes withdrawal, learning, and avoidance. None of that explains why pain hurts. You can explain how visual systems detect edges, colors, and motion. None of that explains why there is a visual scene rather than darkness. This is not a matter of missing details. It is not a problem that will vanish with better instruments. It is a mismatch between kinds of description. Physical explanations are objective. They describe systems from the outside. Consciousness is subjective. It exists only as experience. No amount of objective data contains subjectivity within it. This creates what many researchers now openly acknowledge as an explanatory gap. A gap not between what we know and what we will eventually know, but between two different kinds of understanding. One describes processes. The other describes presence. And this gap does not shrink as neuroscience advances. It becomes sharper. As our descriptions of the brain become more detailed, the absence of experience from those descriptions becomes more obvious. This is why some scientists argue that consciousness cannot be explained in the same way other phenomena are explained. Not because it is supernatural, but because it is fundamental. This idea is often misunderstood. To say that something is fundamental does not mean it is mystical or unscientific. Space, time, mass, and charge are all fundamental. They are not explained in terms of deeper mechanisms. They are starting points. If consciousness is fundamental, then it cannot be reduced to something else. It must be taken seriously in its own right. This possibility makes many people uneasy because it challenges a deeply held assumption about how science works. Science, we like to believe, explains everything in terms of matter and forces. Introducing consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality feels like giving up. But it is not giving up. It is recognizing that reality may contain more than we initially assumed. Physics has already undergone this kind of expansion. Space and time were once treated as separate, absolute backgrounds. Relativity revealed them to be dynamic and intertwined. What seemed obvious turned out to be incomplete. Consciousness may represent a similar moment. Not a failure of science, but a signal that our framework is missing something essential. One way researchers attempt to avoid this conclusion is by denying that consciousness, as commonly understood, needs explanation at all. Some argue that subjective experience is an illusion, or that it is nothing over and above behavior and information processing. But this position creates a paradox. Illusions are experiences. Denying experience requires experiencing the denial. You cannot explain consciousness away without using it. This is why eliminative approaches rarely convince anyone beyond their own theoretical circles. They solve the problem by redefining it out of existence. Another strategy is to say that consciousness will be explained once we understand the brain well enough, even if we cannot see how right now. This is not unreasonable. Science often works this way. But notice what is missing. There is no outline of what such an explanation would look like. No proposed mechanism. No pathway from physical description to experience. Just faith that explanation will arrive eventually. That faith may be justified. But it is not evidence. In other areas of science, even before a problem is solved, researchers can often imagine what a solution would look like. With consciousness, this is strikingly absent. No one knows what kind of discovery would actually explain why experience exists. And this is what makes the problem different. If we do not know what would count as an explanation, then claiming that one will eventually appear is speculative. This has led some scientists to consider an uncomfortable alternative. What if the assumption that consciousness must be produced by the brain is blocking progress? What if by insisting on reduction, we are forcing the phenomenon into a framework that cannot accommodate it? This does not mean the brain is irrelevant. It is clearly essential to the way consciousness appears in humans. But relevance is not the same as origin. The brain may shape, filter, constrain, or localize consciousness without creating it from nothing. Again, this is not a claim. It is a possibility that emerges when standard explanations fail. And failure matters in science. It tells us where our models stop working. The history of science is full of moments when failure pointed the way forward. Classical physics failed at small scales, and quantum mechanics emerged. Newtonian gravity failed at high speeds, and relativity replaced it. In each case, the failure was not ignored. It was taken seriously. The failure to explain consciousness may be signaling something similar. Not that neuroscience is wrong, but that it is incomplete. And until this is acknowledged, progress will remain limited. Once the assumption that the brain produces consciousness is set aside, even temporarily, a deeper problem comes into focus. This problem does not emerge from philosophy alone. It emerges directly from neuroscience itself. Despite decades of progress, there remains a single question that no theory, model, or experiment has been able to answer. Why is there experience at all? Not intelligence. Not behavior. Not information processing. Experience. The feeling of pain rather than the detection of damage. The perception of color rather than the measurement of wavelength. The sense of being a self rather than the execution of functions. This question has become so persistent that it now has a name. The hard problem of consciousness. It is called hard not because it is complicated, but because it appears resistant to the kind of explanation science usually provides. Most scientific problems are hard only temporarily. They are difficult because we lack data, tools, or computing power. Once those arrive, the problem becomes manageable. The hard problem is different. It remains even if you imagine having complete knowledge of the brain. Imagine that we have mapped every neuron, every synapse, every electrical and chemical interaction. Imagine that we can predict every behavior, every verbal report, every decision with perfect accuracy. Even then, the question remains. Why is any of this accompanied by experience? Why is there something it feels like to be that system? Nothing in the physical description answers this. This is not a matter of missing details. It is a mismatch between explanation and phenomenon. A physical description tells you what a system does. Consciousness is not what a system does. It is what a system is like from the inside. This distinction is subtle but critical. You can describe how a thermostat regulates temperature. You cannot describe what it feels like to be a thermostat, because there is nothing it feels like. It has no inner life. But humans do. And the presence of that inner life is what needs explaining. Many researchers initially assumed that once the so-called easy problems of consciousness were solved, the hard problem would dissolve. The easy problems involve explaining how the brain discriminates stimuli, integrates information, controls behavior, and generates reports. These problems are not easy in practice, but they are easy in principle. They can be addressed using standard scientific methods. And progress on them has been impressive. But solving them has not brought us any closer to explaining experience itself. If anything, it has highlighted how separate the problem is. You can solve every easy problem and still have no explanation for why experience exists. This realization has forced scientists to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Consciousness may not be reducible to function. It may not be something that emerges simply by doing enough information processing. It may not be explainable in purely physical terms. This does not mean such explanations are impossible, but it does mean that no one knows how they would work. And this ignorance is not superficial. It is deep. Consider what a successful explanation would require. It would need to explain why certain physical processes are accompanied by experience, while others are not. Why your brain is conscious, but your liver is not. Why a computer running complex algorithms appears to be unconscious, while a human brain is not. No existing theory even outlines how such distinctions could arise. Appeals to complexity do not help. Complex systems exist everywhere. Weather systems are complex. Economies are complex. Galaxies are complex. None of them appear to have experience. So complexity alone cannot be the answer. Appeals to information processing do not help either. Information can be processed without awareness. Machines do it constantly. They receive input, transform it, and produce output, all without any indication of inner experience. Some argue that consciousness arises when information is processed in the right way. But what is the right way? No one knows. And without knowing, this becomes another placeholder rather than an explanation. The hard problem remains. It has led some scientists to an unsettling conclusion. Perhaps consciousness is not something that can be explained in terms of other things. Perhaps it is something that must be included in our fundamental description of reality. This idea is controversial, but it did not arise arbitrarily. It arose because standard explanations failed. When a phenomenon refuses to be reduced, science faces a choice. Either the phenomenon is illusory or the framework is incomplete. Eliminating consciousness as an illusion does not work. The illusion itself would still be an experience. That leaves incompleteness. This is where the hard problem becomes unavoidable. It is not an optional philosophical add-on. It is a direct consequence of taking both science and experience seriously. And this is why the hard problem has not gone away, despite attempts to dismiss it. Every serious theory of mind must address it. So far, none has succeeded. This does not mean science has failed. It means science has encountered its edge. An edge where explanation stops working in the usual way. And edges matter. They tell us where our assumptions no longer hold. In the case of consciousness, the assumption that everything can be explained in terms of physical processes may be under strain. This does not imply that physics is wrong. It implies that physics, as currently formulated, may be incomplete. Just as classical physics was incomplete before quantum mechanics, and Newtonian gravity was incomplete before relativity. The hard problem may be pointing toward a similar expansion. Not yet a solution. Not yet a theory. But a signal. A signal that consciousness is not something we can ignore, reduce, or explain away without changing how we think about reality itself. And that realization marks a turning point. Because once the hard problem is acknowledged, the old assumption begins to lose its grip. The brain may still be essential. But essential does not mean explanatory. The question now is not whether the brain is involved. The question is whether the brain is enough. And that question changes everything. When faced with a stubborn problem, science usually responds in predictable ways. It refines its measurements. It improves its models. It looks for hidden variables. And in most cases, this works. Diseases once blamed on curses turned out to be microbes. Strange astronomical motions turned out to be unseen planets. Seemingly random heat behavior turned out to be statistical mechanics. The pattern is familiar. Mystery gives way to mechanism. So when consciousness resisted explanation, it was natural to assume that the same pattern would repeat. That consciousness would eventually be explained once neuroscience became sufficiently advanced. But something unusual happened. As neuroscience advanced, the mystery did not shrink. It sharpened. This is not because the brain turned out to be more complicated than expected. Complexity can be handled. Science is good at complexity. The problem is that none of the standard explanatory strategies even point in the right direction. Consider the most common approach, explaining consciousness in terms of function. The idea is simple. Consciousness is what the brain does. It integrates information, guides behavior, and enables flexible responses. Once we understand these functions, consciousness will be explained. But notice the sleight of hand. Functions can exist without experience. A system can integrate information without feeling anything. It can guide behavior without awareness. It can respond flexibly without an inner life. Nothing about function logically implies experience. You could build a system that behaves exactly like a conscious human, reports inner states, and passes every behavioral test, and still ask a meaningful question. Is there something it feels like to be that system? If the answer could be no, then function alone cannot explain consciousness. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a central issue in artificial intelligence. Modern AI systems can recognize faces, translate languages, generate text, and defeat human champions at complex games. They perform functions once thought to require consciousness. Yet few people seriously believe these systems are conscious. The reason is simple. They process information, but there is no reason to think there is an inner point of view. Function does not guarantee experience. Another common strategy is to appeal to complexity. Consciousness, it is said, emerges when a system becomes complex enough. When information is integrated across many components in the right way. But complexity exists everywhere. Whether systems are staggeringly complex. Economies involve billions of interacting agents. The internet integrates vast amounts of information across the globe. None of these systems appear to be conscious. Complexity may be necessary for consciousness, but it is clearly not sufficient. At this point, defenders of the standard view often retreat to emergence. Consciousness is an emergent property of brain activity. But emergence is not an explanation. It is a label. Emergence tells us that something new appears at a higher level of organization. It does not tell us why that new thing has the properties it does. Liquidity emerges from molecular motion. But we can explain why. We can derive macroscopic behavior from microscopic interactions. With consciousness, no such derivation exists. There is no known pathway from physical interactions to experience. And without such a pathway, emergence becomes a placeholder rather than a solution. Another strategy is to redefine consciousness itself. Instead of treating it as subjective experience, some theories define consciousness in terms of access, reportability, or self-monitoring. Consciousness becomes whatever a system can report about itself. This move is tempting because it brings consciousness back into the realm of observable behavior. But it comes at a cost. It changes the subject. The thing we care about, experience, is quietly replaced by something else. The theory may explain why a system can talk about its internal states, but it does not explain why those states are experienced. A system could generate reports about pain without feeling pain. A chatbot could describe emotions without having them. Redefinition avoids the problem rather than solving it. At this point, the pattern becomes clear. Every standard strategy either explains something other than consciousness, or assumes consciousness without explaining it. The hard problem remains untouched. This has led some researchers to a striking conclusion. Perhaps consciousness is not something that can be explained by breaking it down into simpler parts. Perhaps it is not a composite phenomenon at all. If consciousness were fundamental, then trying to explain it in terms of non-conscious components would be like trying to explain space in terms of objects that already exist in space. You cannot derive the stage from the actors. This idea runs against scientific habit, but it is not unprecedented. Physics treats certain things as fundamental because they cannot be reduced further. Space, time, mass, charge. These are not explained in terms of something simpler. They are part of the basic framework. Consciousness may belong in this category. Again, this is not a claim. It is a response to failure. When every attempt at reduction fails, science must consider the possibility that reduction is the wrong approach. This is deeply uncomfortable, because it suggests that the universe contains something irreducible that is not captured by current physical theories. But discomfort is not a reason to dismiss an idea. History shows that the most uncomfortable ideas often turn out to be necessary. The failure of standard strategies does not mean that science should abandon rigor. It means that rigor may require expanding the framework. If consciousness cannot be derived from physical processes, then either consciousness is an illusion, which collapses under scrutiny, or physical theory is incomplete. Many scientists now quietly accept this. Not publicly, not definitively, but in the way they speak about the problem. They acknowledge that no current theory explains consciousness. They admit that progress on neural correlates has not brought explanatory closure. They concede that something essential is missing. This is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of honesty. Science progresses by confronting its limits, not by pretending they do not exist. Part 2 is about taking those limits seriously. Not to abandon science, but to understand what it is being asked to explain. And in the case of consciousness, that question is unlike any science has faced before. By this point, the difficulties surrounding consciousness should feel different from other unsolved problems in science. It is not that we lack enough data. It is not that our instruments are too crude. It is not even that the brain is too complex. The difficulty lies deeper. Consciousness resists explanation because it does not fit the structure of explanation itself. To see why, consider how scientific explanations normally work. They explain phenomena by showing how they arise from simpler, more fundamental components. Motion is explained in terms of forces. Temperature is explained in terms of particle motion. Chemical reactions are explained in terms of electron interactions. In each case, the explanation replaces something familiar with something less familiar but more precise. We trade intuition for mechanism. With consciousness, this trade fails. When we attempt to explain experience in terms of neural activity, nothing is replaced. The experience does not dissolve into its components. It simply disappears from the explanation altogether. The physical description continues without it. This reveals something unsettling. Consciousness is not merely unexplained by physical theories. It is invisible to them. No matter how complete the physical account becomes, consciousness does not appear within it. The theory can tell you everything about what a system does, how it behaves, and how it responds to inputs. It cannot tell you whether the system experiences anything. This is not the practical limitation. It is a conceptual one. Physical explanations are designed to describe objective structure and dynamics. Consciousness is neither a structure nor a dynamic. It is presence. And presence is not something physics knows how to describe. This creates a unique tension. On the one hand, consciousness is the most certain fact we know. Every doubt, every theory, every observation presupposes it. You can doubt the external world, but you cannot doubt that you are experiencing something. On the other hand, consciousness is the least understood phenomenon in science. It does not show up in equations. It does not leave a trace in measurements. It cannot be isolated, weighed, or observed from the outside. This puts consciousness in a strange position. It is indispensable, yet theoretically homeless. Attempts to explain it in standard terms keep running into the same wall. If consciousness were identical to some physical process, then describing that process should explain consciousness. But it does not. If consciousness were caused by physical processes, then understanding the cause should explain the effect. But it does not. If consciousness emerged from complexity, then explaining complexity should explain experience. But it does not. Each time, the explanation bypasses the phenomenon it is meant to explain. This is why some researchers argue that consciousness is not just another property of matter. It is a different category of thing. Again, this is not mysticism. It is a recognition of explanatory mismatch. Physics tells us what exists in terms of quantities that can be measured and related mathematically. Consciousness does not fit this mold. It is qualitative, not quantitative. It is about what it is like, not how much or how fast. This is why some philosophers describe consciousness as irreducible, not because it is supernatural, but because reducing it destroys it. If you reduce a painting to pigment chemistry, you lose the image. If you reduce music to pressure waves, you lose the melody. Something essential vanishes. With consciousness, reduction does not merely lose something incidental. It loses the thing itself. This suggests that consciousness may require a different kind of explanation. Not an explanation that replaces it with something else, but one that takes it as a basic feature of reality. This idea sounds radical only because we are not used to thinking this way. But science already treats many things as basic. Physics does not explain why space exists. It describes how it behaves. It does not explain why time flows. It models how it is measured. It does not explain why the laws of nature have the form they do. It takes them as given. These are not failures. They are boundaries. Consciousness may belong on this list. If that is the case, then the brain's role in consciousness must be reinterpreted. The brain would not be the source of experience, but the structure through which experience is organized. This would explain why brain damage alters consciousness without explaining consciousness away. It would explain why changing the brain changes experience without claiming that the brain generates experience from nothing. The brain would shape consciousness, not produce it. This idea is unsettling because it reverses a deeply ingrained assumption. Instead of consciousness emerging from matter, matter would constrain consciousness. Again, this is not a conclusion. It is a possibility that becomes visible only when standard explanations fail. And they have failed. Not temporarily, not partially, but categorically. No physical theory currently explains why experience exists. Some researchers respond by saying that consciousness is simply beyond science, that it is something we must accept without explanation. But this too is unsatisfying. Science has expanded before to include phenomena once thought beyond explanation. Electricity, magnetism, and gravity were once mysterious. They became central to our understanding of the universe. Consciousness may require a similar expansion. Not an abandonment of science, but a revision of what science takes as fundamental. This is why the hard problem is not just another puzzle. It is a pressure point. It forces us to ask whether our picture of reality is complete. If consciousness cannot be explained by physical processes, then either consciousness is illusory, which it cannot be, or physical theory does not describe everything that exists. That is the dilemma, and it cannot be resolved by better data alone. It requires a shift in perspective. By the time scientific research into consciousness reaches the hard problem, something subtle but irreversible has already happened. The conversation has changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, not with declarations or revolutions, but quietly, in the way scientists speak to one another when they are no longer confident that their existing framework is enough. This shift did not occur because neuroscience failed. On the contrary, it occurred because neuroscience succeeded, and in succeeding, revealed a limit it could not cross. For decades, progress in brain science followed a familiar pattern. As tools improved, mysteries shrank. Brain regions were mapped. Neural pathways were identified. Cognitive functions once thought vague or immaterial were linked to specific physical processes. Each discovery reinforced a powerful expectation. Consciousness would eventually follow the same path. It would be reduced, localized, explained. But something unexpected happened. As the map of the brain became more complete, consciousness did not become clearer. It became more elusive. This was not because scientists lacked information. It was because information alone was no longer addressing the question being asked. Neuroscience could increasingly tell us what the brain was doing, but not why any of that activity was accompanied by experience. This distinction is easy to overlook, because in most scientific contexts it does not matter. Explaining what a system does is usually sufficient. Behavior and function are the phenomena of interest. Consciousness is different. Consciousness is not a behavior. It is not a function. It is not an output. It is presence. And presence does not appear in functional descriptions. This realization forced a pause. If consciousness were simply another biological process, then explaining its mechanisms should resemble explanations in other areas of biology. There should be a chain of causation linking physical processes to experiential outcomes. There is not. Instead, what exists is a growing collection of correlations that stop just short of explanation. Certain neural patterns accompany pain. Certain brain networks accompany awareness. Certain disruptions eliminate conscious experience. All of this is true, and none of it explains why experience exists at all. This is the point at which the hard problem stops being abstract and becomes unavoidable. The hard problem is not the claim that consciousness is mysterious. It is the recognition that standard scientific explanation does not even begin to touch it. You can imagine a complete physical description of the brain, every neuron, every synapse, every signal, and still ask a meaningful question. Why is there something it feels like to be this system? Nothing in the description answers that. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a structural mismatch. Physical explanations are third person. Consciousness is first person. No amount of third-person data logically entails first-person experience. This is the pressure point that forces science to reconsider its assumptions. If consciousness cannot be derived from physical processes, then one of two things must be true. Either consciousness is not real, which collapses immediately because the denial itself is an experience, or our physical theories are incomplete. Most scientists instinctively resist the second option. Not because it is impossible, but because it is destabilizing. It raises uncomfortable questions. What does physical really mean? Is physics describing everything that exists, or only everything that can be measured? Are there features of reality that do not appear in equations but are nonetheless real? These questions are not fringe. They arise whenever a phenomenon resists reduction. History shows this pattern clearly. Classical physics did not break before quantum mechanics emerged. It simply reached a point where certain phenomena could not be explained within its framework. The framework was not wrong. It was limited. The same was true of Newtonian gravity before relativity. In both cases, the solution was not to abandon science, but to expand its conceptual foundation. Consciousness may be presenting a similar challenge. Neuroscience excels at describing correlations, constraints, and dependencies. It does not explain existence. And consciousness is existence in its most immediate form. This creates an unusual situation. Science depends on consciousness to operate, yet does not know how to account for it. Every experiment presupposes experience. Every observation occurs within awareness. Consciousness is not something science studies from the outside. It is the condition that makes studying possible at all. This gives consciousness a unique status. It is not just another phenomenon among many. It is the lens through which all phenomena are known. Ignoring this fact does not eliminate the problem. It merely postpones it. This is why alternatives begin to appear in the scientific conversation, not as assertions, but as necessities. When a framework cannot explain a phenomenon that is both undeniable and central, science must consider whether the framework itself needs revision. This does not mean abandoning physical explanation. It means questioning whether physical explanation, as currently formulated, is complete. Some researchers argue that patience is all that is required. That explanation will arrive once neuroscience becomes sufficiently advanced. But patience alone does not substitute for a conceptual pathway. In other sciences, even before a problem is solved, researchers can often imagine what a solution would look like. They know what kind of mechanism they are searching for. With consciousness, no such mechanism is even sketched. No one knows what it would mean in physical terms for experience to arise. This absence is telling. It suggests that consciousness is not simply another variable waiting to be discovered. It may be something that changes how variables themselves are understood. This is why the discussion shifts toward alternatives. Not because they are comfortable, not because they are complete, but because they acknowledge the failure honestly. Some of these alternatives suggest that consciousness may be fundamental, not produced by physical systems, but interacted with by them. Others suggest that our concept of matter is incomplete, and that future physics may include experiential aspects. None of these ideas are presented as answers. They are frameworks, ways of thinking that make the problem intelligible rather than invisible. And this is crucial. Pretending that consciousness will eventually disappear into neural detail does not advance understanding. It delays it. Science progresses not by clinging to assumptions, but by recognizing when assumptions have reached their limits. The assumption that the brain produces consciousness has served as a useful working hypothesis. It has guided decades of productive research. But usefulness is not truth. At some point, the difference matters. That point is now. This does not mean that the brain is irrelevant. It is deeply involved. It shapes experience, structures it, and constrains it. What is being questioned is not involvement, but origin. And that question cannot be answered by repeating correlations. It requires a new way of thinking. Not a rejection of science, but an expansion of it. That is why science is being forced, reluctantly, cautiously, to consider alternatives. Not because it wants to, because it has to. Once science reaches the point where consciousness can no longer be explained as a byproduct of neural activity, a difficult question emerges. If consciousness is not produced by the brain, then what is it? This is the moment where many discussions collapse into confusion. Either the topic veers into mysticism, or it is dismissed entirely as unscientific speculation. Both reactions are understandable, and both miss the point. The idea that consciousness might be fundamental is not a spiritual claim. It is a theoretical move made reluctantly to address a persistent explanatory gap. To understand why this move is even considered, we first need to clarify what fundamental actually means in science. In physics, a fundamental entity is not something mysterious or sacred. It is simply something that is not explained in terms of anything else. Space, time, mass, charge. These are taken as basic ingredients of reality, not because they are simple, but because explanation eventually bottoms out. No one asks what charge is made of. No one demands a deeper mechanism for why spacetime exists. At some point, science says, this is where explanation starts, not where it ends. The proposal that consciousness might be fundamental is an attempt to place it at that starting point, not to elevate it, but to stop pretending it can be derived from something that never produces it. This proposal does not claim that rocks are conscious, or that the universe is thinking. Those are interpretations layered on afterward, often incorrectly. The core claim is much more restrained. It says that experience itself may be a basic feature of reality, just as physical structure is. This idea sounds radical only because we are used to thinking of consciousness as secondary, as something that appears late, after complexity, after evolution, after brains. But this sequence is an assumption, not a demonstrated fact. What science actually shows is that brains correlate with consciousness. It does not show that brains create it. Once this distinction is taken seriously, the question changes. Instead of asking how matter produces consciousness, we ask how consciousness and physical processes relate to one another. This reframing does something important. It removes the impossible demand that physical descriptions somehow give rise to experience, a demand that no physical theory has ever met. And it replaces it with a different question: how do physical systems interact with something that is already there? This is not unprecedented in science. Fields were introduced when forces could not be explained through particles alone. Space-time curvature was introduced when gravity could not be treated as a force acting in a fixed background. In each case, something previously considered derivative was reclassified as fundamental. Consciousness may require a similar reclassification. Importantly, this move does not abandon empirical science. It does not reject neuroscience. It simply recognizes that neuroscience explains structure and function, not existence. A useful way to think about this is to notice what physical theories leave out. Physics describes relations. It describes quantities. It describes how systems evolve over time. It does not describe what it is like to be any of those systems. That omission is not accidental. It reflects the scope of the theory. Trying to force consciousness into that framework is like trying to find color in a mathematical description of light wavelengths. The description is accurate, but incomplete with respect to experience. Some researchers argue that consciousness should be treated the same way mass or charge is treated, as a basic property that systems can have, not something that emerges from arrangement alone. This does not explain consciousness away. It acknowledges it. And that acknowledgement matters. Because denying the reality of consciousness is not a scientific move. It is a philosophical one, and a contradictory one. Experience is the one thing we cannot doubt. Everything else, including the external world, is known only through it. Treating consciousness as fundamental is not mystical. It is conservative. It refuses to explain away the most certain fact we have in favor of theories that never actually address it. At this point, critics often object. They argue that calling consciousness fundamental explains nothing, that it merely labels ignorance. This objection misunderstands the role of fundamentals. Fundamental entities are not explained, they explain. No one complains that physics does not explain why space-time exists. They accept that space-time is part of the basic structure of reality. The same logic applies here. The goal is not to solve consciousness by reducing it. The goal is to integrate it coherently into our picture of the world. This integration has consequences. If consciousness is fundamental, then physical systems do not generate it. They shape it, constrain it, modulate it. The brain becomes a mediator, not a source. This does not diminish the brain's importance. It increases it. Instead of being a machine that magically produces experience, the brain becomes the interface through which experience is structured into perception, memory, emotion, and thought. This view aligns surprisingly well with what neuroscience already shows. Damage the brain, and consciousness changes, not because it is destroyed, but because its expression is altered. Change neural activity, and experience changes, not because experience is created, but because its contents are reshaped. Under this framework, correlations between brain states and mental states are exactly what we should expect. They are not evidence of production. They are evidence of interaction. This distinction matters. It allows us to take neuroscience seriously without forcing it to do something it was never designed to do. It also avoids a common trap, dualism. Treating consciousness as fundamental does not mean separating it from the physical world. It does not posit a ghost interacting with matter in inexplicable ways. Instead, it treats consciousness and physical structure as two aspects of a deeper reality, different, but inseparable. Physics already contains such dual-aspect entities. Light is both wave and particle. Space-time is both geometry and gravity. These are not mystical claims. They are empirical conclusions forced by data. Consciousness may require a similar conceptual expansion. Another concern often raised is testability. If consciousness is fundamental, how could this ever be tested? The answer is uncomfortable but honest. Many fundamental features of reality are not directly testable in isolation. They are inferred because they make sense of what we observe. We do not observe space-time directly. We infer it from consistent patterns in measurement. Similarly, consciousness as fundamental would be inferred if it allows us to coherently relate subjective experience to objective structure without contradiction. This does not mean abandoning rigor. It means accepting that explanation sometimes requires changing the starting assumptions, not just refining the details. At this stage, it is crucial to emphasize restraint. No serious researcher claims that consciousness as fundamental is established fact. It is a proposal, a response to failure, a way to keep the scientific project honest rather than pretending a solution exists where it does not. What makes this proposal compelling is not that it answers everything. It clearly does not, but that it avoids pretending that the hardest part of the problem is already solved. It acknowledges ignorance without surrendering to it. And that is often how progress begins. This is why discussions of consciousness have increasingly shifted toward foundational questions rather than technical ones. Not because science has stalled, but because it has reached a point where deeper assumptions must be examined. Treating consciousness as fundamental is not an endpoint. It is a starting point. It opens new questions rather than closing old ones. How does consciousness relate to physical law? Why do certain systems support rich experience while others do not? What determines the structure of experience? These are difficult questions. But they are questions we can at least ask coherently. That alone is progress. Once the possibility is taken seriously that consciousness may not be generated by the brain, a natural objection immediately arises. If the brain does not produce consciousness, then why does damage to the brain alter consciousness so reliably? Why does anesthesia eliminate experience? Why does injury distort perception, memory, personality, and identity? Why does electrical stimulation of neural tissue evoke specific sensations and thoughts? At first glance, these facts seem decisive. They appear to prove that the brain is the source of consciousness. But this conclusion depends on an assumption that deserves closer scrutiny. That correlation implies generation. Science is careful about this distinction in other domains. With consciousness, it is often overlooked. To see why, consider how we interpret dependency relationships elsewhere. A radio depends on its internal circuitry to receive and decode a signal. Damage the radio, and the sound degrades or disappears. Adjust its components, and the output changes. Remove power, and silence follows. From these facts alone, it would be tempting to conclude that the radio creates the music. But it does not. It shapes, filters, and expresses a signal that exists independently of the device. This analogy is often dismissed too quickly, not because it is flawed, but because it is uncomfortable. The analogy does not claim that consciousness is a signal transmitted through space, nor that the brain is literally a receiver. Analogies are not identities. They illuminate structure, not substance. The key point is this: dependency does not entail origin. A system can be essential for the expression of something without being its source. This distinction is rarely made explicit in discussions of consciousness, but it is crucial. When neuroscientists observe that specific brain states reliably correspond to specific conscious states, they have demonstrated dependence, not production. The inference that the brain generates consciousness is an additional philosophical step, not an empirical finding. The interface model reframes this relationship. Instead of asking how matter creates experience, It asks how physical systems structure and constrain experience. Under this model, the brain is not a factory producing consciousness from non-conscious parts. It is an interface that shapes how consciousness appears. This immediately explains why brain damage matters. If the interface is damaged, the output is distorted. Memory loss does not imply that consciousness has been destroyed. It implies that access to certain contents is impaired. Personality changes do not imply that consciousness is rewritten. They imply that expression is altered. Anesthesia does not turn off consciousness itself. It disrupts the interface so completely that no experience can be reported or remembered. Importantly, this model does not deny any neuroscientific data. It accepts all of it. It simply interprets it differently. And this reinterpretation solves a problem that the production model never addressed. If consciousness were produced by the brain, then at some point in evolution, matter would have crossed a threshold where experience suddenly appeared. No physical account explains how or why that would happen. The interface model avoids this issue entirely. Consciousness does not suddenly emerge. It is already there. Biological evolution refines interfaces, not existence. This makes sense of gradualism. As nervous systems become more complex, experience becomes more structured, not because consciousness is increasing, but because its organization is becoming richer. This aligns with evolutionary continuity without requiring a magical moment of creation. Critics often argue that the interface model is unfalsifiable. But this criticism misunderstands its purpose. The interface model is not a competing empirical theory. It is an explanatory framework, a way of interpreting empirical data without contradiction. Physics is full of such frameworks. When space-time curvature replaced gravitational force, experiments did not suddenly change. Interpretation did. Similarly, adopting an interface model does not change neuroscientific results. It changes what those results are taken to mean. Another common objection is that this model risks dualism. But this risk only exists if consciousness and physical systems are treated as separate substances interacting mysteriously. The interface model does not require this. It allows consciousness and physical structure to be deeply intertwined without reducing one to the other. Think again of familiar scientific examples. Temperature is not identical to molecular motion, but it depends on it. Software is not identical to hardware, but it depends on it. In neither case do we claim that the dependent phenomenon is unreal. We recognize levels of description. Consciousness may be such a level, irreducible, but not disconnected. This view has an important consequence. It explains why decades of increasingly detailed brain research have not yielded an explanation of experience itself. Because experience is not in the brain the way blood is in veins or electricity is in wires. The brain describes patterns. Consciousness is presence. The interface model respects both. It does not force consciousness into neural terms, nor does it deny neural influence. This balance is precisely what gives the model its appeal. It also explains something that production models struggle with: why conscious experience feels unified. The brain is massively distributed. There is no central location where everything comes together. Yet experience feels singular. Production models struggle to explain this unity. Interface models do not. The interface shapes a single experiential field, even if its physical mechanisms are distributed. This is not a proof. It is coherence. And coherence matters when explanation stalls. It is also worth noting that the interface model does not imply that consciousness exists independently of all physical systems. It implies that consciousness is not generated by them. This distinction is subtle but essential. Without a functioning interface, conscious experience may not be structured in any recognizable way. This explains why consciousness appears absent in states like deep anesthesia or coma. Absence of reportable experience does not entail absence of consciousness itself. It entails breakdown of access, integration, or memory. Science cannot currently distinguish between these possibilities, and pretending otherwise is misleading. The interface model does not fill this gap with speculation. It leaves it open. That openness is a strength, not a weakness. One of the most striking implications of this view is how it reframes the question of artificial consciousness. If consciousness is produced by computation alone, then sufficiently advanced machines should eventually become conscious. If consciousness is fundamental, then computation may only structure experience if it interfaces with whatever consciousness is. This does not settle the debate. It clarifies it. The question becomes not how complex must a machine be to generate consciousness, but what kinds of systems can interface with consciousness. This is a different research direction entirely, and it is one that neuroscience, philosophy, and physics must confront together. At this point, it is crucial to emphasize what this model does not claim. It does not claim proof. It does not claim completion. It does not claim certainty. It claims adequacy. It fits the data without contradiction. It respects the limits of current explanation. It avoids pretending that correlation equals causation. That alone makes it worth taking seriously. Science advances by eliminating incoherent explanations, not by clinging to familiar ones. The interface model remains tentative, but it is internally consistent in a way that production models increasingly are not. This is why serious researchers discuss it cautiously, not publicly promote it loudly. And this is why it appears in peer-reviewed literature far more often than popular science suggests. Not as doctrine. As possibility. At this point, something important must be said clearly. None of the ideas discussed so far are answers. They are not solutions. They are not conclusions. They are not discoveries. They are responses to a failure, the failure of existing explanations to account for consciousness without contradiction. This distinction matters more than anything else in this entire discussion. Because the greatest danger in conversations about consciousness is not ignorance. It is false resolution. When explanations feel satisfying, people stop questioning them. When narratives feel complete, uncertainty disappears, even if understanding has not increased. Science advances by resisting that temptation. The proposals you have encountered, consciousness as fundamental, the brain as interface, are not claims about what reality is. They are attempts to describe what reality might have to be like if the data we already have is taken seriously. They are frameworks, not facts. And frameworks must be held lightly. This is where many discussions go wrong. Once an alternative to materialism is introduced, it is often treated as a replacement belief. Something to accept, defend, and promote. That is not how science works. Science does not replace one certainty with another. It replaces confident error with careful uncertainty. That is exactly what is happening here. The classical materialist picture of consciousness is not being abandoned because it is unfashionable or philosophically unsatisfying. It is being questioned because it fails to explain the very phenomenon it claims to explain. But recognizing failure does not automatically produce truth. It produces space. Space for new questions. Space for new models. Space for better thinking. That space must not be filled prematurely. One of the most important lessons in the history of science is that recognizing the limits of a theory is often more valuable than extending it beyond its domain. Newtonian physics was not wrong. It was incomplete. It worked brilliantly until it did not. Classical electromagnetism was not wrong. It was incomplete. It failed quietly at atomic scales. In both cases, the temptation was to force existing concepts to do work they could not do. The progress came when scientists accepted that a deeper framework was needed. Consciousness research is in that exact position now. The brain as generator model explains many things. It explains behavior. It explains processing. It explains correlation. What it does not explain is experience itself. Admitting this is not a weakness of science. It is a strength. It is an act of intellectual honesty. The alternative frameworks discussed earlier are valuable precisely because they do not pretend to solve the problem. They merely show that other ways of thinking exist, ways that avoid contradiction and respect the data. This restraint is essential. The moment any framework claims to explain consciousness completely, it should be treated with suspicion. Because no such explanation exists. Even proposals that treat consciousness as fundamental face profound unanswered questions. If consciousness is fundamental, why does it take the specific forms we experience? Why are experiences structured the way they are? Why does consciousness appear associated with certain physical systems and not others? These are not minor gaps. They are central. Likewise, the interface model raises questions it cannot answer. What determines the structure of the interface? Why does the brain interface with consciousness in the way it does? Why does damage affect experience so precisely? These questions remain open. And they should remain open. Because closing them prematurely would mean replacing one mystery with another, rather than deepening understanding. This is why serious researchers speak cautiously. They do not announce revolutions. They do not make grand claims. They do not promise solutions. They describe constraints. They say, this explanation cannot work, this assumption fails, this framework is inconsistent. That negative progress is real progress. Knowing what cannot be true narrows the space of what might be. This is where the philosophy of science quietly re-enters the conversation. Science is not just about accumulating data. It is about interpreting data within coherent frameworks. When frameworks fail, data alone cannot save them. This is why debates about consciousness persist even as neuroscience advances. The problem is not lack of data. It is lack of a conceptual structure that can accommodate both objective measurement and subjective experience. The temptation, especially in popular discussions, is to treat uncertainty as failure. It is not. Uncertainty is what honest science looks like at the frontier. When physicists speak about quantum gravity, they are explicit about what they do not know. When cosmologists discuss the origin of the universe, they distinguish between extrapolation and evidence. Consciousness deserves the same discipline. There is no shame in saying, we do not know. There is danger in pretending that we do. This brings us to a crucial point. Why does this restraint matter so much? Because consciousness is not just another scientific problem. It sits at the intersection of physics, biology, philosophy, and lived human experience. When claims about consciousness overreach, they do more than mislead scientifically. They distort how people understand themselves. Overconfidence here has consequences. Claiming that consciousness is nothing but brain activity is not a neutral scientific statement. It is a philosophical position with ethical and existential implications. Claiming that consciousness is everything is equally problematic. Both reduce complexity. Science's role is not to provide comfort or certainty. It is to provide clarity. And clarity, at this stage, means acknowledging the limits of what can responsibly be said. We have seen why materialist explanations struggle. We have seen why alternatives are considered. We have seen why those alternatives remain incomplete. This is not indecision. It is precision. The most honest position today is this. Consciousness is real. Brains are deeply involved. The nature of their relationship is not understood. Any claim beyond that exceeds the evidence. That may feel unsatisfying, but it is exactly how science progresses. Certainty comes later, if it comes at all. Many foundational questions remain open for decades or centuries. The nature of time, the interpretation of quantum mechanics, the origin of the universe, none of these are settled. Consciousness belongs in that category. And that is not a weakness of the field. It is a sign that the field is touching something fundamental. What matters now is not which framework wins, but how rigorously they are tested, constrained, and refined. Future discoveries may favor one view, combine several, or render all of them obsolete. That is how science actually works. The greatest mistake would be to mistake provisional models for final truth. This is why it is so important to end this part where it ends. Not with resolution. Not with belief, not with comfort, but with honesty. Because only honesty leaves room for discovery. By now, it should be clear that the question of consciousness is not just a technical problem in neuroscience. It is not simply about neurons, synapses, or brain regions lighting up on a scan. It is a question that quietly reaches into the foundations of how we understand reality itself. Because the moment we admit that consciousness cannot be cleanly reduced to physical processes, something profound happens. Our picture of the universe changes. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but irreversibly. For centuries, science has progressed by stripping reality down to its most basic components: matter, energy, forces, fields. The success of this approach has been extraordinary. It has given us modern physics, chemistry, biology, and technology beyond anything previously imagined. But this success came with an assumption so deeply embedded that it often goes unnoticed. The assumption is that reality can be fully described from the outside. That if we know the structure, behavior, and interactions of physical systems, then we know everything there is to know. Consciousness challenges this assumption in a way no other phenomenon does. Because consciousness is not known from the outside. It is known from the inside. Every scientific description, no matter how objective, is ultimately interpreted within experience. Measurements do not exist on their own. They are read, understood, and given meaning by conscious observers. This creates a subtle but unavoidable loop. Science describes the universe. But the universe, as described, exists only as it appears within consciousness. This does not mean the universe depends on us in a naive or solipsistic sense. It means that experience is not something added on top of reality. It is part of the way reality shows up at all. Ignoring this fact works surprisingly well in many domains. When studying planetary motion, consciousness is irrelevant. When calculating trajectories or chemical reactions, experience plays no role in the equations. But when the subject of study becomes consciousness itself, the omission becomes impossible to ignore. You cannot explain experience by removing experience from the picture. This is why the question of consciousness reaches beyond neuroscience into physics, cosmology, and metaphysics. It forces us to ask what kind of thing reality is. Is reality fundamentally made of stuff that exists independently of any experience? Or is experience woven into the fabric of existence in a way we do not yet understand? These questions are uncomfortable because they destabilize a worldview that has been enormously productive. But science has faced similar destabilizations before. Space and time were once considered absolute backgrounds, fixed stages on which events unfolded. Einstein showed that this picture was wrong. Space and time were not passive containers. They were dynamic, relational, and inseparable from matter and energy. That insight did not invalidate classical physics. It reframed it. Likewise, treating consciousness as something fundamental does not invalidate neuroscience or physics. It reframes them. It suggests that physical description may be one aspect of reality, not the whole story. This reframing has far-reaching consequences. If consciousness is not merely an emergent byproduct, then explanations that ignore it are incomplete by definition. Reality is not just what can be measured. It is also what can be experienced. This does not weaken science. It strengthens it by making explicit what was previously implicit. Consider how we define reality in everyday language. We say something is real if it exists whether or not anyone is thinking about it. Mountains, stars, atoms, these are real. But consciousness is also real. More real, in a sense, than anything else. It is the one thing we cannot doubt. Even doubting requires it. This creates a strange asymmetry. The most certain thing we know is the least well explained. And the most successful theories we have say almost nothing about it. This asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects a historical bias toward third-person description. Science excels at describing what systems do. It struggles to describe what systems are like. This is not a flaw of science as a method. It is a limitation of its current conceptual tools. When those tools encounter a phenomenon they cannot handle, science has two options. It can deny the phenomenon, or it can revise its assumptions. Consciousness has forced the second option. Once this revision begins, it becomes clear that the implications extend far beyond the brain. They touch the very idea of explanation. What does it mean to explain something? In most sciences, explanation means showing how complex behavior arises from simpler components. Molecules explain gases. Cells explain tissues. Neurons explain behavior. But consciousness does not fit neatly into this hierarchy. Experience is not built out of simpler experiences in any obvious way. It appears as a unified field, not an assembly. This suggests that explanation in the case of consciousness may not be reductive at all. It may be structural or relational instead. Just as space-time geometry explains gravity without reducing it to a force, consciousness may require a different explanatory strategy. This realization changes how we think about the universe at large. If consciousness is fundamental, then the universe is not just a collection of interacting particles. It is a place where experience occurs. That does not mean the universe itself is conscious in any familiar sense. It means that experience is not alien to reality. It is not an accident or an afterthought. It belongs. This idea resonates with a growing recognition in physics that our most basic descriptions may not be final. Theories of quantum gravity suggest that space-time itself may not be fundamental, that it emerges from deeper, non-spatiotemporal structures. If space and time can be emergent, then the assumption that consciousness must be emergent begins to look less obvious. Perhaps our intuitions about what is basic and what is derivative need revision. This is not speculation for its own sake. It is an attempt to make sense of stubborn facts. Consciousness exists. Brains correlate with it. Explanation fails at the point where experience should appear. Something has to give. What makes this moment in science unique is that the challenge comes not from exotic data, but from ordinary experience. Every conscious moment is evidence, and that evidence refuses to be explained away. This forces a shift in perspective. Instead of asking how consciousness fits into the universe, we may need to ask how the universe fits into consciousness. Not in a subjective or idealistic sense, but in an explanatory one. What kind of universe allows experience to exist at all? This question echoes through cosmology as well. The laws of physics appear finely structured. Small changes would prevent the formation of complex systems, chemistry, or life. Some interpret this as coincidence, others as selection effects. Very few consider consciousness as part of the explanation. Yet consciousness is the one feature that gives the universe meaning at all. A universe without experience is indistinguishable from the inside, from nothing. This does not mean the universe requires observers to exist. It means that existence, as understood, is inseparable from experience. These ideas are unsettling because they blur boundaries we are used to keeping sharp. Subjective and objective. Observer and observed. Mind and matter. But those boundaries may be conceptual conveniences, not features of reality itself. Science has crossed similar boundaries before. Wave and particle. Space and time. Matter and energy. Each time, the deeper theory did not eliminate distinctions. It showed how they emerged from something more fundamental. Consciousness may demand a similar unification. This does not imply a final theory or a simple answer. It implies that our current map of reality is incomplete. And recognizing that incompleteness is not a failure. It is progress. What makes this moment especially important is that consciousness research sits at the intersection of multiple disciplines. Neuroscience provides data. Physics provides structure. Philosophy provides conceptual clarity. None of these alone is sufficient. Together, they begin to outline the shape of a problem that cannot be solved from a single angle. This interdisciplinary pressure is a sign that the question is deep. Shallow problems stay within one field. Deep problems spill over. Consciousness spills everywhere. And because it does, it forces us to reconsider what kind of explanations we accept as complete. It also forces humility. The universe has repeatedly shown that it is stranger than our intuitions. Whenever science has assumed that reality must conform to common sense, it has been wrong. There is no reason to expect consciousness to be an exception. What we can say, carefully, is this. The question of consciousness is reshaping our understanding of reality, not because it offers new answers, but because it exposes old assumptions. It reminds us that explanation is not the same as description, that correlation is not causation, that experience is not optional, and that the deepest questions often emerge not at the edges of knowledge, but at its center. We have learned an extraordinary amount about the brain. But the more we learn, the clearer it becomes that the brain is not the whole story. This realization does not diminish science. It elevates it, because science, at its best, is not about defending worldviews. It is about following questions wherever they lead, even when they lead us to rethink reality itself. If the question of consciousness reshapes how we think about reality, it also reshapes something even closer to us. It reshapes how we think about ourselves. Not in a dramatic, mystical, or motivational sense, but in a quiet, unsettling, and deeply philosophical way. Because once the idea is taken seriously that consciousness may not simply be generated by the brain, the standard story of human identity begins to loosen. For centuries, identity has been tied to substance. First to the soul, then to the body, more recently, to the brain. The modern scientific picture tells a clear story. You are your brain. Your memories, personality, beliefs, emotions, and sense of self are all the result of neural activity. Change the brain, and you change the person. There is truth in this picture. Brain damage can erase memories. Injury can alter temperament. Disease can transform identity beyond recognition. These facts are undeniable. But what they demonstrate is dependence, not definition. They show that who you are is shaped by the brain, not necessarily that you are identical to it. This distinction is subtle, and it matters more than it first appears. To see why, consider what we usually mean by identity. Identity is not just a list of traits. It is not merely behavior. It is the sense of being a continuous subject of experience. You remember being you yesterday. You anticipate being you tomorrow. You experience the present moment as happening to you. This continuity is not something you observe from the outside. It is something you live from the inside. Neuroscience can describe the mechanisms that support memory, anticipation, and self-modeling. It cannot describe what it is like to be the subject those mechanisms serve. This gap becomes especially clear in cases where identity appears fractured. Consider patients with severe brain injuries. Some lose autobiographical memory but retain awareness. Others retain memory but lose emotional resonance. Some undergo profound personality changes while still reporting a continuous sense of being someone. Which of these changes destroys identity? There is no clear answer. Because identity is not located in any single function. It is not reducible to memory alone. Not to personality alone. Not to cognition alone. It is something more basic, the persistence of experience itself. If consciousness is fundamental, then identity is not something the brain manufactures from nothing. It is something the brain organizes, expresses, and stabilizes. This reframing helps make sense of a puzzle that has long troubled philosophy and neuroscience alike. Why does identity feel continuous even though the brain is constantly changing? Neural cells die and regenerate. Synaptic connections rewire. Beliefs shift. Memories fade or distort. Yet through all of this, there remains a felt sense of being the same subject. Production models struggle to explain this persistence without invoking memory as a substitute. But memory can fail while the sense of I am remains. Under an interface framework, this persistence is not mysterious. Consciousness does not need to be rebuilt every moment. It does not blink in and out of existence. What changes is not the existence of experience, but its contents. The brain provides continuity of structure, a narrative, a personality, a body image, but the presence of experience itself is already there. This does not mean identity is immutable. On the contrary, it explains why identity is both stable and fragile. Stable, because consciousness itself persists. Fragile, because the structures that shape it can be disrupted. This perspective also reframes ethical questions. If identity is nothing more than brain activity, then altering the brain alters the person completely. In extreme cases, this raises uncomfortable implications. At what point does someone cease to be the same person? When memory is lost? When personality changes? When values shift? These questions are not hypothetical. They arise in medicine, law, and end-of-life care. A purely reductionist view offers no principled answers. It treats identity as a bundle of functions, none of which has priority. An experience-centered view, by contrast, places continuity of subjectivity at the core. As long as there is experience, there is someone there. This does not solve ethical dilemmas, but it clarifies what is at stake. It also changes how we think about mental illness. Conditions like depression, dissociation, or depersonalization often involve a disruption of the sense of self rather than a loss of cognitive ability. Patients frequently report feeling detached from their own experience, as if consciousness itself has become distant or muted. These reports are difficult to fit into models that treat consciousness as an on-off switch generated by neural firing. They make more sense if consciousness is present, but its interface with emotion, meaning, and self-representation has been altered. Again, this does not reject neuroscience. It deepens it. It suggests that treating mental illness is not just about correcting chemical imbalances or neural circuits, but about restoring coherent access to experience. This perspective also complicates how we think about death. If consciousness is strictly identical to brain activity, then death is the absolute end of experience. If consciousness is fundamental, then death represents the collapse of the interface, not necessarily the annihilation of experience itself. Science cannot currently adjudicate between these possibilities, and it is important not to pretend that it can. What matters here is not which view is true, but how the assumptions we adopt shape our understanding of human life. A worldview that treats identity as purely mechanical risks flattening the richness of experience. A worldview that treats consciousness as untouchable risks drifting into unfalsifiable belief. The challenge is to navigate between these extremes. The approach emerging in contemporary consciousness research does exactly that. It refuses to reduce identity to mechanism alone. It refuses to replace mechanism with mysticism. Instead, it treats identity as an open question grounded in lived experience and constrained by empirical data. This has implications for how we view ourselves as individuals. You are not just a collection of neural firings. But you are also not something separate from your brain. You are the subject for whom neural activity matters. This framing preserves responsibility, agency, and meaning without denying biology. It also explains why personal identity feels deeply personal yet universally recognizable. Everyone knows what it means to be conscious. No one needs it explained. And yet no one can point to where, exactly, that you resides. This tension is not a problem to be solved away. It is a feature of what it means to be human. As science pushes deeper into the nature of consciousness, it does not strip humanity of mystery. It clarifies where the mystery truly lies. Not in superstition, not in ignorance, but in the fundamental structure of experience itself. Understanding this changes how we approach questions of value. If consciousness is fundamental, then suffering is not just a byproduct of malfunctioning systems. It is something real in its own right, something that demands moral consideration. Likewise, well-being is not just efficient processing. It is the quality of experience. This perspective quietly reshapes ethics, medicine, and social policy, even if it is never explicitly acknowledged. And it does so without requiring belief in anything supernatural. It only requires taking experience seriously. That may sound obvious. But historically, science has not done this. It has explained experience without explaining being the experiencer. Now that omission is being confronted. What emerges is not a comforting answer, but a more honest picture of identity. You are a conscious subject whose experience is shaped, constrained, and organized by a biological system. Neither side of that description can be removed without losing something essential. This balanced view avoids extremes. It avoids the claim that humans are nothing but machines. It avoids the claim that humans transcend biology entirely. It places identity at the intersection of experience and structure. And that intersection is precisely where science, philosophy, and lived life meet. If the science of consciousness feels unfinished, that is not an accident. It is exactly what a frontier looks like from the inside. In textbooks, science appears orderly. Concepts are clean, definitions are precise, and problems are neatly solved. But in reality, scientific progress is uneven, uncertain, and often uncomfortable. Consciousness research sits precisely at that uncomfortable edge. Not because scientists lack intelligence or data, but because the problem itself resists the tools that have worked so well elsewhere. To understand where consciousness science is going, it helps to understand where it cannot go anymore. For much of the last century, the dominant strategy was that consciousness would eventually be explained the same way other biological phenomena were explained, by finding the right mechanisms. The hope was simple. If we map the brain in enough detail, consciousness will reveal itself. That hope has driven extraordinary achievements. Brain imaging, neural modeling, computational neuroscience, all have advanced rapidly. And yet, the central mystery remains untouched. This has forced a quiet reassessment. The future of consciousness science is unlikely to come from more of the same. It will not come from just higher resolution scans. It will not come from just larger datasets. It will not come from just faster computers simulating neural networks. Those tools are valuable, but they are not sufficient. The future lies in integration. One of the clearest signs of this shift is how interdisciplinary consciousness research has become. Neuroscientists are now in conversation with physicists. Physicists are engaging with philosophers. Computer scientists are questioning assumptions about intelligence and experience. This is not a sign of confusion. It is a sign that the problem has outgrown any single discipline. Historically, the deepest scientific revolutions have occurred at these intersections. Quantum mechanics emerged where classical physics met unexplained phenomena. Relativity emerged where Newtonian mechanics met the limits of speed and gravity. Consciousness may demand a similar convergence. One promising direction involves rethinking the foundations of physics itself. Modern physics is extraordinarily successful at predicting behavior, but it is strangely silent about meaning and experience. It tells us how systems evolve, not what those evolutions feel like. Some researchers have begun to question whether this silence is a feature of reality or a feature of the theories. If space-time, causality, and even locality may be emergent rather than fundamental, as some approaches to quantum gravity suggest, then the assumption that consciousness must be emergent begins to look less certain. This does not mean physics secretly contains consciousness. It means our current physical descriptions may be incomplete in ways we do not yet understand. Another future direction involves refining what we mean by explanation. Much of neuroscience focuses on correlation and prediction. These are powerful tools, but explanation may require something different. Explaining consciousness may not mean deriving experience from equations. It may mean identifying lawful relationships between physical structure and experiential structure. In other words, the science of consciousness may become less about where consciousness comes from and more about how it is shaped. This shift is subtle but profound. It reframes the goal from elimination to understanding. Artificial intelligence provides another lens into the future. For decades, AI research assumed that increasing computational complexity would eventually produce consciousness. Build a system complex enough, and experience would emerge. That assumption is now under serious question. Modern AI systems can perform astonishing tasks. They recognize faces, generate language, and solve problems that once required human intelligence. And yet, there is no evidence that they are conscious. They behave intelligently. They do not experience. This gap has forced researchers to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Intelligence and consciousness may not be the same thing. If that is true, then building smarter machines will not necessarily bring us closer to understanding experience. Instead, it may clarify what consciousness is not. The future of consciousness science may involve identifying the specific conditions under which experience occurs, conditions that go beyond computation alone. This has implications not just for AI, but for how we think about life, cognition, and mind. Another area of future research involves altered states of consciousness. For a long time, these states were dismissed as irrelevant or pathological. But increasingly, they are being studied as windows into the structure of experience itself. States induced by meditation, anesthesia, psychedelics, or trauma reveal how flexible and fragile conscious experience can be. They show that consciousness is not a fixed thing, but a dynamic field shaped by attention, meaning, and integration. Studying these states does not explain consciousness away. It exposes its architecture. The future may involve mapping experience itself, not just the brain. This is a difficult idea to accept because science has traditionally avoided first-person data. But avoiding it has not made the problem go away. Carefully integrating subjective reports with objective measurement may be one of the only paths forward. This does not mean abandoning rigor. It means expanding it. Just as physics learned to incorporate probabilistic descriptions at the quantum level, consciousness science may need to incorporate experiential structure as a legitimate domain of study. None of this guarantees success. The future of consciousness science is uncertain precisely because the problem is deep. But that uncertainty is not a weakness. It is an invitation. An invitation to rethink assumptions. An invitation to develop new conceptual tools. An invitation to accept that not all progress looks like reduction. And this is where curiosity becomes commitment. If you are interested in questions like this, not because they offer quick answers, but because they demand careful thinking, then you are engaging with science at its most honest level. These are not questions that will be resolved in a single experiment or a single lifetime. They unfold slowly. They require patience. They reward humility. This is why channels that explore these topics carefully exist. Not to provide certainty, but to accompany the process of understanding. Soft CTR placement. If questions about consciousness, time, reality, and the limits of science matter to you, not as entertainment, but as genuine inquiry, then staying with explorations like this makes sense. Because this is where the interesting work is happening. The future of consciousness science will not look like a finished theory presented confidently to the public. It will look like ongoing dialogue, revision, and debate. It will involve false starts and partial insights. And that is exactly how foundational knowledge grows. What matters is not arriving at answers quickly. What matters is asking the right questions carefully. Consciousness has forced science to slow down, to reconsider what explanation means, to confront the limits of objectivity, to acknowledge the role of experience itself. That slowing down is not stagnation. It is maturation. And whatever form the future science of consciousness takes, whether it involves new physics, new neuroscience, or entirely new frameworks, it will emerge from this moment of honest uncertainty. That is where we are now, at the beginning of a deeper inquiry. As we come to the end of this exploration, it is worth pausing, not to conclude, but to take stock. Because if there is one lesson consciousness research teaches more clearly than any other, it is this. Understanding does not always arrive in the form of answers. Sometimes it arrives as clarity about the limits of what we know. And that clarity matters. Over the course of this journey, we have encountered a series of claims that are often presented as facts in popular discussions. That consciousness is produced by the brain. That subjective experience will eventually be reduced to neural computation. That once we understand the mechanisms, the mystery will disappear. What we have seen instead is something quieter, but more honest. We have seen that consciousness is real, that the brain is deeply involved, and that the nature of their relationship remains unresolved. These statements may sound modest, but they represent a hard-won position. They reflect decades of empirical work, philosophical analysis, and theoretical struggle. They also reflect restraint. In science, restraint is a virtue. It is tempting to push beyond the evidence, to offer explanations that feel complete, to resolve uncertainty with confidence. But history shows that premature certainty is the enemy of progress. When scientists believed space and time were absolute, they missed relativity. When they believed determinism was complete, they missed quantum mechanics. When they believed life could be explained without chemistry, they stalled. Each advance required admitting ignorance first. Consciousness now occupies that same position. We know enough to know that something is missing, but not enough to say what it is. This realization can feel unsatisfying. We want closure. We want answers. We want a final theory that explains why experience exists at all. But science does not always provide closure. Sometimes it provides something more valuable. Orientation. We are no longer lost in vague mystery. We are no longer mistaking correlation for explanation. We are no longer pretending the problem is already solved. We know where the boundary is. And knowing where the boundary is changes how we think. It allows us to stop asking the wrong questions. Instead of asking how the brain produces consciousness, we begin asking how physical structure and experience relate at all. Instead of asking where consciousness comes from, we ask what kind of reality allows it to exist. These are not easier questions, but they are better ones. They respect both the data and the experience that data cannot capture. They also remind us of something essential about science itself. Science is not a machine for generating certainty. It is a method for refining understanding. Its greatest strength is not that it answers everything, but that it tells us when we are asking too much of a theory. General relativity does not explain quantum phenomena. Quantum mechanics does not explain gravity. And neuroscience, at present, does not explain consciousness. These are not failures. They are signposts. They tell us where new ideas are needed. What makes consciousness different is that it is not an external mystery. It is not a distant galaxy or an abstract particle. It is the medium through which all mysteries are known. This makes the temptation to overreach especially strong. But it also makes humility especially important. Because when it comes to consciousness, certainty feels personal. Claims about consciousness shape how we think about ourselves, about meaning, about value, and about responsibility. That is why caution matters. It is easy to say, you are nothing but your brain. It is easy to say, consciousness is everything. Both statements feel definitive. Both are unsupported. Reality, as usual, is more subtle. You are not reducible to neural activity alone. But you are not separable from it either. You are a conscious subject whose experience is shaped, constrained, and organized by a biological system. That is not a disappointing conclusion. It is a profound one. It places human identity at the intersection of structure and experience. It allows science to remain empirical without becoming dismissive. It allows philosophy to remain rigorous without drifting into speculation. And it leaves space, real space, for future understanding. This is why uncertainty here is not a problem to be eliminated. It is a condition to be respected. There is a tendency, especially in modern culture, to equate not knowing with weakness. But in science, not knowing is often a sign that you are close to something important. The hardest problems are not solved quickly. They reshape the landscape. Consciousness has already done that. Neuroscience is more careful now. Philosophy is more empirically informed. Physics is more open to foundational questions. None of this would have happened if the problem were trivial. And none of it requires us to abandon rigor. What it requires is patience. The patience to let theories mature. The patience to sit with incomplete explanations. The patience to resist turning possibilities into beliefs. This patience is rare. But it is essential. Because the moment we mistake a framework for an answer, inquiry stops. What we have now is something better than an answer. We have a map of what we know. We know that consciousness is not an illusion. We know that neural activity matters. We know that explanation breaks down at the point where experience should appear. We also know what we do not know. We do not know whether consciousness is fundamental. We do not know whether it emerges from deeper physical principles. We do not know whether future science will radically revise our current picture. And that is okay. Because science has always advanced by working within that tension. Between what is established and what is unknown. Between confidence and doubt. Between explanation and mystery. This tension is not something to escape. It is something to inhabit. In that sense, consciousness research is not an anomaly. It is science doing exactly what it is supposed to do at the edge of understanding. So if this exploration has left you without a clear answer, that is not a failure. It means it has done its job. It has clarified what is at stake. It has separated evidence from assumption. And it has shown why the most honest position, right now, is one of careful openness. The story of consciousness is not finished. It may not even have properly begun. What we are witnessing is the slow realization that some questions require new ways of thinking, not just better measurements. That realization does not diminish the achievements of neuroscience, physics, or biology. It completes them, because science, at its best, is not about closing questions. It is about keeping the right ones alive. And consciousness is one of those questions. A question that touches reality, identity, and meaning without collapsing into easy answers. A question that reminds us that understanding the universe also means understanding our place within it. If you value this kind of exploration, slow, careful, and honest, then continuing it matters. Not because answers are guaranteed, but because the questions themselves are worth asking. That if you find yourself drawn to these ideas, not for certainty, but for clarity, then staying with thoughtful explorations like this makes sense. Subscribing is simply a way to continue the conversation, one careful question at a time. There is no rush. The mystery is not going anywhere. And neither is the work of trying to understand it. There is a temptation, at the end of every long inquiry, to resolve everything, to close the circle, to summarize neatly, to walk away with certainty in hand. But consciousness does not allow that. Not because we have failed, but because the subject itself resists being closed. After everything we have explored, the brain, the theories, the limits of explanation, one truth stands quietly in the background. We are still here, still aware, still experiencing, still inside the mystery we are trying to understand. And that fact alone should give us pause. Because no matter how advanced our science becomes, no matter how detailed our models grow, consciousness remains the one thing that cannot be stepped outside of. You can study stars from a distance. You can analyze atoms without becoming one. But you cannot observe consciousness without being conscious. Every explanation happens inside the thing being explained. That makes this mystery different. Not unsolvable, but intimate. What science has given us is not a final answer, but a clearer boundary. We now know that reducing consciousness to brain activity alone explains less than we once believed. We know that correlation is not causation. We know that experience is not a side effect we can safely ignore. And perhaps most importantly, we know that pretending otherwise is no longer intellectually honest. This is not a failure of neuroscience. It is not a defeat of science. It is the moment where science grows up enough to admit its own edges. For centuries, human beings believed the universe revolved around them. Then we learned it did not. Later, we believed time was absolute. Then we learned it was relative. We believed matter was solid. Then we learned it was mostly empty space. Each time, reality turned out to be stranger, but richer, than our intuitions. Consciousness may be the next such turning point. Not because it proves anything mystical, but because it reveals something incomplete in our picture of reality. And incompleteness is not something to fear. It is something to explore. Think about what it means to be alive right now. You are not a passive observer of the universe. You are the place where the universe is appearing. Colors exist because they are seen. Sounds exist because they are heard. Meaning exists because experience exists. Without consciousness, the universe may still be there, but it would be a universe without perspective, without value, without story. A universe that happens, but to no one. That does not make consciousness magical. It makes it fundamental. Not in the sense of knowing what it is, but in the sense that nothing makes sense without it. And that realization changes how we relate to knowledge itself. It reminds us that understanding reality is not just about equations and mechanisms. It is also about humility, about recognizing that the deepest truths may not be the loudest ones. The mystery of consciousness does not ask us to abandon reason. It asks us to use it more carefully, to distinguish between what we know, what we assume, and what we simply do not yet understand. And that distinction matters, especially today. In a world obsessed with certainty, with instant answers, With oversimplified explanations, admitting uncertainty is a radical act. But it is also a necessary one. Because pretending we already know what consciousness is does not bring us closer to the truth. It only closes the door prematurely. What lies ahead may not look like a single breakthrough or a final theory. It may look like slow integration, careful revision, new ways of thinking that feel uncomfortable at first. That is how real progress usually happens. And until then, we live inside the question. Every thought you have, every memory, every moment of awareness. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a reality to be respected. The brain is extraordinary. The universe is vast. But consciousness is the thread that connects them. And whatever it ultimately turns out to be, one thing is already certain. It is not trivial. It is not an illusion. And it is not something we can afford to misunderstand. The mystery remains. Not as a failure of knowledge, but as an invitation. The universe may be vast and ancient, but right now, it is being known, here, in awareness. And that may be the most important fact of all.